Hello, Peter the Cat here. I'm speaking to the microphone just to see if that improves the audio. But anyway, I'm wearing a black armband in this video in memory of our dog, Sully. We had to put him down a while ago, but I miss him a lot, and he was really great to have around. Anyway, to get on to the topic of the video, I wanted to continue what I did last time, talking about the lost Garfield character, Lyman. Last time I was just going over his history, but in this video, I want to go over like what I think are his best, quote-unquote, well, not really his best, but what I think are the most notable Lyman comics. He appeared from 1978 to 1983, and most of the comics we'll look at come from the first 2 years of Garfield, where he appeared the most. As a bonus, I'll also look at some Lyman comics from Norm Nat when he was a bug, and from the 1976 John comic. So let's get started. This first comic we'll look at is kind of surprisingly violent, for early Garfield. I think this is the only time where like Garfield gets violent with Lyman. He normally picks on like Nermal and Odie. Jim Davis could have made a joke that maybe since Lyman is a dog owner, he's inexperienced with cats, and so he doesn't know he shouldn't rub Garfield the wrong way. But a later comic strip establishes that Lyman actually owned 4 cats before, so he should have known better. But it is kind of strange that early Garfield comics are kind of violent. I mean, there's no blood or guts or anything, but it's still just kind of surprising. Like, Jim Davis was a bit more willing to be more edgy in the early years of Garfield. The only time you see Garfield being this violent, I think, is either when he's beating up the mailman, or if you're playing him in Nickelodeon All-Star Smash Brothers, or whatever this is called. This next comic, again, more violence. I mentioned this in my inappropriate Garfield comics video. This is the only time I think we see Lyman disciplining Odie. If you look in the second panel, it looks like Lyman is actually strangling Odie, so again, on a surprising amount of violence that I don't think Jim Davis would draw these days. This was originally a John comic, where Odie's name was originally Spot, and of course, since his name was changed, Jim Davis had to rewrite the joke. So it's kind of interesting that Jim Davis put a little subtle reference to the original version of Garfield from the John comic here. Also in the original John comic, Jim Davis actually drew Lyman holding the newspaper, whereas in the redrawn version, for some reason Lyman's has the newspaper sticking out of his sleeve. That's just very strange looking. This is another comic, even more violence in early Garfield comics. This is something I think Jim Davis could have done to make John and Lyman's relationship more interesting, contrasting the differences between a cat owner like John and a dog owner like Lyman. Of course, Lyman says you need a dog for security, but then we see that Garfield viciously chases Odie with his fangs out and everything, and that makes Lyman cry, seeing how pathetic Odie is. If Jim Davis did more comics like this, contrasting cat and dog owners, then I think maybe he could have kept Lyman around a bit longer. Garfield doesn't just hunger for lasagna, he hungers for the
taste of blood!
Okay, this is one comic that it's notable to me because I just didn't get what the joke was until I saw that this was a rewrite of a Norm Nat comic where originally it had a slug wearing treads to go really fast, but then for whatever reason Jim Davis decided to rewrite this comic with John and Lyman. What's strange is he rewrote this comic twice. First, as Norm Nat, and then he did it as a John comic, and then as a Garfield comic, but he just didn't bother to rewrite the joke. I don't get what the joke of this comic is supposed to be. Is Lyman's description of these tennis shoes supposed to be funny? If you've seen artwork of me, I'm a bear paw kitty. I don't do shoes, so I'm not sure, is it supposed to be funny that wearing a special pair of tennis shoes turns Lyman into Sonic the Hedgehog or something? Now that I think about it, imagine if Lyman had Dr. Eggman's mustache. If the comic was I don't know, maybe a Sunday comic, so there's more panels and Lyman's running so fast he's playing tennis with himself, maybe that could have been funny, but as a daily comic it just doesn't make any sense, and that's why it's kind of memorable. This comic is just strange because I think this is the only time we see Lyman really dress up. I mean, I think there's one comic where he dresses up in a disco suit that Garfield sheds on, but he dresses really outrageously here, and Garfield makes a reference to some guy, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Beau Brummel or something. This is kind of an out there reference that I'm not sure many people would get unless, I don't know, you're into the history of fashion or something. The clothes Lyman wears here is just so strange. I know there's a lot of jokes that John has no style and he wears horrible outfits, but whatever Lyman is wearing here is just a much bigger eyesore than anything I've seen John wearing. This is a rare comic where it's just Garfield and Lyman alone with each other, and there's no John or Odie, and for some reason Lyman is doing a disco dance. I mean, I think he wears a disco suit in that one comic where Garfield sheds on him, but so I guess that's one character trait Lyman has. He's into disco, but the dance he's doing here, like, it does not look like a disco dance. He's not going to be winning any Dancing with the Stars competitions anytime soon. The weird dance is like the only thing that makes this comic notable, and it kind of shows how underwritten Lyman was. Lyman could have easily been replaced with John in this comic, and it wouldn't really change a thing. Here's another comic that is surprisingly violent for Garfield. Now, this is another comic I also mentioned in my Inappropriate Garfield Comics video. Lyman kicks Odie, and then in the last panel, John strangles Lyman. What got into Jim Davis? Did he have a bad day at work and then he just drew this comic to vent or something? I guess that's kind of interesting. Like, if you press Lyman's buttons the wrong way, then he can be violent towards Odie. That's kind of dark. Jeez. And of course, John strangling Lyman, I'm sure, kind of feeds into the theory that, John killed Lyman and then shoved him in the basement. I don't know, maybe Jim Davis looked at this comic and that's where he got the idea. Lyman only appears in the last panel of this comic, but it's notable because this is like the only time Odie ever speaks in the comic strip. You have Garfield trying to bother John, feed me, and they just go into a poking war, and then Lyman's like, I'm glad I'm a dog owner, I don't have to put up with this, and then Odie pokes Lyman and is like, feed me. Well, we have dogs here at home. Sully, rest in peace, Scamp and Bella. And the dogs, especially Bella, can be very, very needy when they want to be fed. So that's not really a difference between cats and dogs. Dogs can be very impatient when they want to be fed, too. Could you imagine if an animated version of this comic was adapted into Garfield and Friends, and Greg Berger had to voice Odie, actually speaking? That'd be kind of strange. This comic is notable for being like the only time we get any backstory on Lyman. Basically, John asks Lyman, have you ever owned any cats? And Lyman's like, yeah, I had 4 of them. They were named Cat, 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 and Cat. And the punchline is, what's the point of naming an animal if it won't come to you when you call it? This is notable to me because, this is the only time we ever get any backstory about Lyman. Everything about, Lyman liking animal photography, that was invented solely for the Garfield show. All it really exists to do is to add fodder to Garfield wiki editors. Oh look, we found a character trait about Lyman other than he disappeared from the comic 5 years into its run. Lyman owned 4 cats at one time. There we go. Now, that'll pad out his wiki article a bit. Now in this comic, Lyman doesn't say a word. It's just Garfield yelling, and he startles John, Odie, and Lyman. But the last panel is what makes this memorable to me, because Lyman, since he has a mustache, when it stands on, all his hair stands on end, it looks like his face exploded in the last panel, so that's why it's notable to me. And if I added a little mouth on it, he'd look like a Fuzzy from Super Mario World, so it's just a very strange drawing of Lyman. I think this is my favorite Lyman comic, one comic where he doesn't say a word. He's just drawn very strangely. Those were the top 10 best, in heavy quotes, Lyman comics, in my opinion. But as a bonus, let's look at some Lyman comics from Norm Nat and the 1976 John comic. I'll start with Norm Nat, where Lyman was a bug. Now, in this comic, I didn't know that in tennis, when you have 0 points, it's called love. So this comic was kind of a learning experience for me. And this comic was also remade into a John comic, but was not remade into a Garfield comic. And I can take a guess why. Lyman mistakenly thinks that Norm Nat is in love with him. And, of course, when this was remade into a John comic, it's Lyman thinking that John is in love with him. And I can take a wild guess that maybe Jim Davis didn't want to do a comic that had the suggestion of homosexuality or something. I guess comics that mention, gay and lesbian lifestyles and stuff was more common in underground comics, like Fritz the Cat. And maybe I should do a sequel video, the most inappropriate Norm Nat comics or something. Making a comic that references homosexuality isn't really that inappropriate. For the 70s it might have been really edgy, but today, not so much, unless you're living in, a Republican state or something. I don't know. Don't say gay in the comics. This is a comic from a storyline where Norm Nat is a failing comedian. And I think Quentin Reviews mentions in his Norm Nat video that Jim Davis drew this comic in frustration that he wasn't getting anywhere with Norm Nat. This comic is just notable to me for the punchline that, why don't all the other comedians get the hook? Well, it's because they're Jewish. That's what Lyman says in the last panel. I'm not sure this is a joke Jim Davis would do these days. He tends to avoid referencing religion and politics. I'm not sure, was Jim Davis jealous of Jewish comedians or something? I know he says he enjoys the Three Stooges, so I don't think Jim Davis has a grudge against Jewish comedians or something. I guess this is just a joke that Jim Davis didn't think about, and I don't know. This might be another comic I don't think he would do these days. It's kind of surprising that these really early Norm, Nat, and John comics, have jokes that, Jim Davis has definitely kind of tried to clean up his act, I guess. Now, a weird thing about Norm Nat is that it would often break the fourth wall. There's one comic where Norm Nat is talking to Jim Davis, hey, erase this spiderweb I'm stuck in. And of course, this, breaking the fourth wall would be repeated in Garfield and in Garfield Friends and even the Garfield show. This is one comic where Lyman is normally kind of stupid, but here he actually is kind of intelligent. Norm Nat asks, how do I spell rhythm? Lyman just looks up and sees the word in the speech bubble and spells it that way. An interesting bit of comic strip breaking the fourth wall. And there's even another comic where Lyman does wordplay, putting random G's in front of words that start with the letter N as a play on Norm Nat's name. Jim Davis kind of had some fun with breaking the fourth wall very early on, and I'm sure that inspired all the fourth wall breaking jokes later in Garfield and Friends. This comic is notable to me because Norm Nat gets mugged. Most Norm Nat comics are really not that great, but seeing Norm get mugged is kind of a highlight to me, and Lyman is of course there, being quippy and everything. History kind of repeated here. Norm Nat is the main character, but Lyman gets all the punchlines. Then when Jim Davis did the John comic, John was the main character, but Garfield got most of the punchlines. And eventually Jim Davis decided, maybe I should make Garfield the main character instead. And I guess Jim Davis learned, kind of learning from his mistakes, having the straight man as the main character, that doesn't work out for me. It's better if I just have the more snarky character be the main character instead. Now, I mentioned in my last video that Lyman was named after a real-life friend that Jim Davis had. I don't know if, how good of friends they were, because this one comic where Norm Nat says, I hate Lyman, was Jim Davis and the real-life Lyman more like rivals or something? Or was this just a joke Jim Davis did to make fun of his friend Lyman? So this is kind of strange to think about. What was Jim Davis's actual relationship with his friend Lyman, and how much of these comics are based on their actual interactions or something? That's something I kind of wonder, and that's why this comic is memorable to me. And now we'll look at some John comics. Now, this is one comic where it wasn't recycled into a Garfield comic later on. And we get this weird line from Lyman saying that, if God intended women to be at the Indy 500 or something, then he would have put a gasoline alley in the ladies' room or something. Again, I don't think Jim Davis would do religious-themed jokes. I mean, I think there is one Garfield comic where he says, if God intended dogs to bark, he would have given them branches or something. Still, it's just kind of strange seeing a strange joke like this come from Lyman. I have to wonder if Jim Davis kept doing jokes about women like these, in the present, would Garfield get canceled or something? I'm not really sure. At this time, the John comic was renamed Garfield, and this is the last comic Jim Davis did for the Pendleton Times before he relaunched it in June of 1978. And we have a very strange final joke here. Lyman says, in my church, I don't believe in bleeding on Sundays. And John is like, I'll make you bleed. Tell me, do you bleed? You will. Again, it's kind of strange that Jim Davis does these violent comics early on when he first started out drawing Garfield and everything. And what's really strange is that this comic actually started out as a Norm Nat comic, but it was just Norm by himself saying, I don't believe in bleeding on Sundays. But then when Jim Davis recycled this comic, he added, John and Lyman together. Again, it's kind of strange to see this weird animus between, John, who's kind of an author avatar for Jim Davis, and Lyman, his friend. Again, I have to wonder, what exactly was the relationship between Jim Davis and the real-life Lyman? Was it really that friendly if Jim was writing comics like this? Or did he just have, a very strange sense of humor he had with the real-life Lyman? So there we go. Those were what, in my opinion, the best Lyman comics. And as you can see, even Lyman's best comics weren't really that great. So it's easy to understand why Jim Davis just stopped having him appear after a couple years. I had an interesting time rereading all these old Garfield comics and just seeing how much the strip has changed from 1978 to the present. I know people often say, Garfield's repetitive and everything, but if you really read the old Garfield comics, it's kind of surprising, this type of stuff Jim Davis did earlier in his career that I don't think he would do today. I don't think he'd do a joke about Jewish comedians in the upcoming Alcon Entertainment Garfield movie. Will we see Lyman in the Alcon Entertainment Garfield movie? I don't know. But if we do, if Lyman does suddenly make a reappearance, I hope he gets a bit more depth and everything. I think that's all I have to say. So, Peter the Cat here. Bye, everybody. And next time,
if I feel like it, maybe I'll review the Long Lost Lyman 4-parter from the Garfield show, and eventually I'd like to do another list video where I talk about my favorite Garfield and Friends episodes. So, see you all later.